TopMedTalk.
Hello and welcome to TopMedTalk Down Under. I'm Kate Leslie and I'm here with my co-host Andy Cumpstey at the Australian and New Zealand College of Anaesthetists and Faculty of Pain Medicine annual scientific meeting in Brisbane. It's the largest anaesthesia meeting in our region. We're having a great 2 days so far, Andy, with lots of great science.
Absolutely. We've just come from a really outstanding plenary session with lots of really interesting topics. We heard about the drug problem with global health and the quite astounding fact that the low-resource countries are having to spend more resources to get the same medicines that we're taking for granted. And then, given the number of times I'm being told this week how old I am, I found it quite interesting about the older patient having anaesthesia with Vanessa Beavis and Deborah Cully, who are looking forward to speaking to later on TopMedTalk.
Yes, and we're also talking to Amanda Barrick and Deb Devonshire about their work setting up anaesthesia training in Mongolia.
Absolutely, the surprise extra one that wasn't on the session, so you heard that here first.
Another first for TopMedTalk Down Under. So right now we've got two great guests on the couch to talk about publishing. And first we'll get them to introduce themselves.
Morning, Kate. Thanks for the invite to come talk to you today. My name's Matt Wiles. I'm from the UK, based in Sheffield. My clinical time, which has become increasingly limited, is mainly neuroanaesthesia, critical care and trauma. My increasingly busy role is I'm now editor-in-chief for the journal Anaesthesia.
I'm Jim Rathmell. Thanks very much for the invitation. I am a professor at Harvard University and chair of the department at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and recently the enterprise chair for the Mass General Brigham healthcare system. And as of January, I'm the editor-in-chief for Anesthesiology. My clinical area has long been chronic pain and cardiac anesthesia, kind of a funny combination of two. But in recent years as chair, I've just gone back to the general pod where I can work with the early residents in training.
Now, I must say, I feel a bit of schadenfreude here because instead of me flying for 24 hours to London or 17 hours to Boston, you chaps have done that for us here in Australia. How was the flight?
Long. I think a big appreciation was how big Indonesia was. Because on that little map, we seem to be flying past Indonesia forever, and it felt never ending. And then you hit the west coast of Australia and realise you're still nowhere close yet.
Yes.
It's a fantastic city to visit. It's been a great meeting. Yeah, really glad to be here.
And Jim, your trip was very fraught.
Yeah, slightly shy of miserable. Cancelled one day and then a good 24 hours the next. But all well. And it's fantastic to be here. And this morning's sunrise over the South Bank here in Brisbane was just absolutely gorgeous.
Very special place, isn't it?
And there's nothing like a bit of sun to get rid of your jet lag.
Well, I mean, there were people in here doing yoga this morning with goats and puppies running around. So as we were recording a recap for yesterday, I was thinking I should be doing that to get rid of my jet lag. But that's one of the extra sessions that you can do here at the annual scientific meeting if you wish. So there you go. So we should probably start talking about publishing. So I guess a very open question to start to both of you. What do you think are the upcoming challenges for the journals in anaesthesia going forwards?
I mean, I think we're all grappling with this out of the gates. What exactly is facing us ahead? And I think for anesthesiology, the first big change was January 1st. We stopped most of our print circulation and went to online only. We have more than 45,000 subscribers and something shy of 200 opted in to continue to receive the print journal. Well, there's probably others that just didn't get the memo that want it, but it's a small proportion. And so I think that's the first big challenge. And you know, Matt, there's plenty more challenges, but
we're mainly a UK-based journal, and certainly within UK research, we are still suffering from the effects of the pandemic in terms of research restarting is a major problem. So there's a lot of historical studies that haven't quite been finished or aren't quite there, and some new bits and pieces trying to get started again, which means that our copy is getting thinner than it might have been, which as the editor-in-chief is your biggest worry. It's the only thing that keeps you up at night.
Yeah, and agreed.
And do you think that's the print issue is a really interesting question? Do you think that's the same issue for us in the United Kingdom, or is that slightly different?
We've only got around 300 people who opt in.
It's the same numbers.
The number gets smaller every year. I suspect it's more at one end of the seniority spectrum than the other. I think people coming through at the bottom each year don't want a paper copy. They live in an electronic world, and it'll be an easy transition. And on environmental grounds and ease of access and linking. There's overwhelming reasons to move to online only.
So, I mean, I grew up, my parents were printers, so run a printing business, but maybe the printing industry is dead. Is that fair to say? Is it all going to be online, electronic? Is that the way it's going to be going in the future? Or is there still going to be a need to print some things for people to see in publications?
So I don't think the print industry is dead. I think they've migrated largely to preparing online copy. That makes a lot of sense. So there's a lot to the print industry that doesn't involve ink and print presses. So I think that the future's bright. Is just different. I want to echo what Matt said about that we saw a decrease in submissions through 2022 and 2023. Actually, there was a mid-pandemic surge because I think people were in their offices publishing. And then there was a big decline, and now it's starting to pick up. And we are seeing 20% Q1 2023 to 2024 increase in submissions. So I'm very hopeful that we're back in the research business again. The other point to follow up on is, what do we do with online only? You know, we've said we've gone to online only, and I think the challenge for us as editors is to make use of that format so that it's super appealing to readers and it gets them to where they want to go quickly. It's a great challenge, but it's going to be really fun to do because it makes it a lot easier to get the material very, very quickly and bypass all of the obstacles to getting to what you want to really read.
So is the monthly issue dead now? Should we just abandon that and have, online things as they become available?
It almost is. The monthly issue is for referencing and archiving as a convenient mechanism. Most of our work will go into early view, 3 to 4 months, depending on the amount of copy, 3 to 4 months before it hits an issue, by which time, when it almost arrives in the issue, people are, oh no, I've seen this. This is almost old news by the time you hit that official labelling of an issue. So yeah, I think it's and now they changed the citation guidelines so that it's as soon as it hits early view, your citation clock starts. From an editorial point of view, the issues are nice. People like to have a nice little reference, but it's not really serving much purpose.
So what are some other challenges you think are facing, the traditional subscription journal model in the future?
Well, the business of publishing, right? So for decades, probably hundreds of years, publishing has relied on advertisers, right? And the print copy of that advertisement was critical because it got in front of X number of people and they could prove that it was mailed out to those people and that they saw it. And that's now changed to, how do we get that advertisement right in front of someone who's highly likely to appreciate the information because it'll help them in clinical practice, or for the advertiser, it'll help sway them. And how do we, as the keepers of the scientific information, make sure that's not too distracting, that it's factual, that it's bringing factual material? So it's really hard because you have to review that material quickly. You've got to say, does it really jive with the published literature? And then is it going to be too distracting if it's popping up here and there as you go through the material? And that's really hard as an editor because it takes a part of your brain you've never used as a scientist before to say, how do I make sure that this supports the publication of the journal? Because that's the finances of actually the business model for doing what we do as editors-in-chief without being distracting to the dissemination of science. And
just certainly our publishers still say it almost seems strange in the 21st century that its print adverts are so much more financially viable to them. Advertisers pay more for print rather than online. Right. And then, as you say, it's trying to find that nuance between not destroying your website, not having 43 adverts within every single PDF and losing your readership whilst it is a publishing business, and it does have to sing for its own supper as well at times.
It's a bit like the difference between free-to-air TV and streaming services, where you can just not see any ads at all, but pay for the privilege.
Well, I think there's a lot of similarities in that as well, in that, again, having done some film work last year for a different organisation, but they were talking about putting together streaming programs. They had to think about the speed with which people could access the programs. And I think, as you talked about, the speed with your business is changing rapidly, isn't it, with the publishing business? If it's online now, not in a month's time in the issue, that changes the metrics and the citation counts. And how do you factor that speed into the the processing? Is that changing how you do things?
Well, I would say we're primarily driven by what the authors, the scientists themselves want. They want it out there as quickly as possible. So one of the things that's really emerged is the pre-publication sites, right? Preprint sites where we only had that in basic science, and it made a lot of sense for physics, right? You do a physics experiment with a big linear accelerator and you get it online, and someone can replicate that tomorrow, begin the replication process. That's really important in that business. In a clinical trial, there's a lot of nuance. Are we concluding what the evidence really shows based on a detailed statistical analysis, or are we overplaying the secondary results? And if you do that in the preprint, you can have some really important observations that don't hold up in the final publication. And we're sort of wrestling with that. But the important thing for us is authors want it out there as quickly as possible. The minute that the proof is done, it's published within 24 hours, and then out it goes. And so issues aren't as important to authors and readers.
So just to be clear for our listeners, you can put your work online before it's been reviewed, and you can put the journal will put your work online after it's been reviewed, but before it's been copy edited and put into the final format, and then the journal will put it online looking like the final article, just not in an issue. And what we've been talking about is the pre-reviewed thing, and that was big in COVID, wasn't it?
Really big, yeah.
Yeah. Matt, what's your take on preprints?
I mean, they're part of life. It was very much COVID was the accelerant that really drove this forward. There are big concerns because there was a view, particularly if you went into the dark places on Twitter, about this was the end of the publication model. We should just use preprint servers. Peer review can happen on Twitter. People will make their own decisions, and that's fine. Exactly as you say, Jim, I think the nuance of what the journals do add is the robustness of the peer review process, and then a tempering of some of the findings and maybe a focus on exactly what the study can and can't say. Without that, there's a risk that you get the abstract read, clinical decisions made, and there's no deep dive into it. We're happy to accept work like that. It's the way going forward. We got quick during COVID. I think our record from submission to online typeset paper was 7 days for the really key work came out. And, it comes in, you're going, people need to know this today. And we managed to turn some bits around within a week. And I guess that was a bit of a challenge to us all in the editorial world to say there is now an expectation in the 21st century that things happen quicker. The idea that manuscripts disappear into a peer review process and typesetting and come out 12 months later just isn't people aren't going to take.
I mean, you're talking there about almost a new metric, aren't you? Kind of speed to publication is something that both the authors and readers are interested in. But perhaps for our listeners, it's also worth just recapping some of the more traditional metrics and things we talked about, citations already, and how that might work. I know you gave a great summary of that in your talk yesterday, Matt, but there may be some people listening who don't fully understand that.
Yeah, I mean, citations are the basis of impact factor, which love it or loathe it, and it seems to be challenged regularly, whether this is a meaningful metric for journals, for authors, for publications. It's still an important driver, and a lot of academic centres will still judge their faculty on the basis of where they publish and the number of citations they get. So it would be naive to say it has no value, because it clearly does. I think there is a rise to alternate metrics or alt metrics, and that certainly gives you a better idea of the clinical impact of studies. So actually, how widely are these shared, read, and downloaded? There are plenty of very good studies that have a low citation count, but are game changers in terms of practice. They're not citable research, but it's clinically useful. And I always think, when we talk to the reviewers and the other editors, we do have to bear in mind the point of research is to make clinical care better, usually. And if that means taking something with a low citation count, then so be it. That's part of our job.
And how does, so you mentioned Twitter or now X, and there's Facebook and Instagram and all these other social medias. And I mean, is that changing your alt metrics and impact? Or is it more to the traditional news outlets, the mainstream press and TV, or is it a mixture of all of that?
It's all of that. A lot of Twitter's changed a lot. I mean, the algorithm's now open and published, so people know how it works. It used to be all about impressions and views, and that changes regularly. I mean, it's Mike Charlesworth, who I work with, a journalist. He seems to be ahead of the curve and always knows what's happening next. I don't even pretend to understand it. he comes and tells us, oh, Facebook's what your dad uses. We're not on Facebook. Snapchat didn't work, right? You can't do papers in 10 seconds and disappear, so it would appear. So,
yeah, but social media is important. And I would say that the last generation of editors for anesthesiology, that was really my job the last 8 or 10 years, is to bring the content in a understandable way and disseminate it in many different formats. So, and incorporating visual abstracts, incorporating infographics, making things visually appealing, and then getting them out in little snippets, one article at a time, where people can click through. And so we're measuring those things. And I think it's yet to be determined exactly what all of those different outlets mean in terms of reader engagement and change in clinical practice. But I think people want it in many, many different forms. And I think it's up to us to provide it in the forms that people are going to access and enjoy accessing.
Yeah. So, Matthew, tomorrow you're talking about AI and publishing. And for our listeners, that can go from anything from a spell checker in Word through things like Grammarly that fix your grammar or sort of rewrite your work, and then through AI-generated text that's based on real data, and then AI text that's based on made-up data. So there's a whole range of different AI things that are going on. Can you preview your talk for us?
Very much going to be the good, the bad, and the ugly. Exactly as you say, Kate. There's a lot that's going to make life easier and save time for researchers and clinicians. So yeah, we use it all the time. The spell checker in Word, the annoying little paperclip that appeared many years ago, and the integration of AI into standard programs that we're going to use. So everyone's waded through Excel saying, how do I change the weight line of this part of the axis to 1.5 points? And then you have to Google it and watch a YouTube video. You're going to be able to tell Excel, change the axis to this, and it will just happen. It will be able to give you points how to analyze data. Its ability to create infographics will take your message and make it easier to get across. So there's lots that's really good. There are threats, and certainly the problems with AI hallucinations. It's a bit like...
Can you explain what that is?
Yeah. So AI is really just large language models, and that learns language as a child learns language. So children don't have any understanding of rules of grammar or spelling. They absorb a huge amount of data and then learn almost on a frequency model how these are put together and and that's exactly what it does. Like a child, it's also quite keen to please. So if it doesn't know the answer, it will go, it's probably something like this. Why don't I put this in? So if you ask it to cite references and add it, it will quite happily give you a reference, but often one that does not exist at all. And we've certainly had not whole AI-generated papers, but certainly AI-generated letters. And the more you read, the more you pick up the language. AI uses a very slightly odd type of language and a slightly odd type of structure. So it's being used. And a very clever librarian recently just did a complete word analysis of all publications. And on the frequency of specific AI common words, estimated that at least 600,000 articles had probably had significant AI creation within them. Some of that may be just people checking it or using it. For authors with English as a second language, it's a really useful tool because the language checking services are incredibly expensive, particularly for researchers from low or middle income countries. So it's an incredibly useful tool for them, but it has the potential to be used nefariously.
The challenge ahead is how can we use it to ease the burden for authors and editors and reviewers? And I think that we're experimenting at Anesthesiology with a number of things, and one is just if you dump all of your material in, can it help you to format it? That's a simple thing, but a real time saver if you're spending a lot of time format. On the other end is generating summaries of our own articles. But there's a lot of fear about taking your copyrighted material and dumping it into a large database where it becomes incorporated in that database. I think much of that fear is unfounded because we still have the original. You're always going to go back to that original as the source of truth. But there's fear, particularly among publishers, of saying we're losing the copyright, the value that we have, the intellectual property that we own. I think on the far end of the spectrum is the worry that AI is already good enough to generate a totally fictitious database that has all of the variation in it that we used to use to detect, right? So if things didn't vary enough, we said it's not biologically plausible. But now AI can generate things that has that variability in it. And I think we probably already are seeing completely fictitious papers and that's what worries me most, is that it gets through the peer review process into print without any of us knowing and guides clinical practice, and it was completely fictitious. And I don't know if we're going to get tools soon enough to avoid some of that, but I bet we're going to have some stories very, very soon that tell us this is something that got all the way through. And my fear as an editor is someone's testing me. They're doing that, putting it through the peer review process and seeing if I can detect it. And, maybe that's an unfounded fear, but that's a fear that I live with.
But I think that's a fear of the reader too. They want to be reading, well-assessed, good quality research which has been checked and carefully considered. And there's risks that isn't happening if you go around the process, isn't it? So I think that's a really, really important thing for us all to be doing in the research industry. I'm just going to tack left slightly. I know we're slightly short on time, but there was a really popular session this morning in the conference, which was, I think, sold out, looking at women in science, technology and engineering and medical technologies. And I think it's really topical to think about the diversity in publishing. So I'm just going to throw that out to you both and see how you think that's going to progress over the immediate and near future.
I'll be very honest. My next editorial is coming out in just a couple of weeks, and the July issue talks a lot about my first goals with the journal. And at the very top of the list is to increase the diversity writ large. And that means all of the usual markers of diversity, including the women and minorities groups represented on the editorial board, and subspecialty practice, region of the world you live in. All of those things are very, very important to getting the message to an international audience suitable, right? We need to get those opinions in the review process on the editorial board. It will dramatically change the way that the journal looks and feels. And that's very, very important to me. It's important to me as a chair, as I bring people into the department on the faculty, and it's extremely important to me as the editor-in-chief that we get those voices. And so it will change. And we'll have an open call for associate editorial board members just in the coming weeks to try and get all of you to nominate people for the best people in the world to do those jobs.
Agree 100%. There's nothing but value in having diversity in your editorial board across the board. Clinical, geographical, gender. I know it's incredibly important. I think we also need to be sure that we're measuring this. If you don't know what you're doing, how do you know where you're at? I think it's good for journals to be quite overt about their makeup. Ideally, have their statistics front and open about proportions. And similarly, we've just started doing that for our authors as well. So we will tell you what our acceptance rates are, what our publication rates are. At the moment, just limited to gender, but then we're going to expand that across the board. We need to be looking at that, and if we're not receiving those submissions or we're not publishing them, then we need to look at ourselves as well and say, well, are there barriers with us? Are there barriers to submission? Are there barriers in the wider academic world? Because if we don't look at these and measure them, then we can't ever improve it and aim for complete equity.
Those sound like fantastic initiatives. On behalf of women in medicine, I thank you for driving those forward. Our publisher, Elsevier, at the British Journal of Anaesthesia, is providing us with author and reviewer gender, race and ethnicity information. And that's going to help us anonymously work out if we're sending our papers to enough people from minoritized groups and the performance of those people to a certain extent. That won't be on an individual basis, but it will help us really find out how to contact the people we want to draw into our journal, as you are with yours. So it's very exciting, I think.
We've talked about this before in the last few days, more offline than on the podcast, but with this diversity question, I think people from some of these minority backgrounds, sometimes women, feel slightly less confident at putting themselves forward to do this. And if they're sitting back at home with, for example, a really good e-post they presented here or a really good service evaluation, I mean, what would you say to them about how do they get that into print? How do they push themselves forward to publish that? Because it can be quite intimidating. I mean, so I'm sitting here with 3 expert editors at different journals. I'm not on an editorial board at all. It's quite an intimidating place for people to come forward and push that work. How do you encourage people to make that first step?
My approach is going to be for all of the editors on our journal to be out there interacting with the people who are at all stages of their careers and encouraging to bring it forward. Even if you fail in that first attempt, you will learn an extraordinary amount in that first attempt. And then the second part is encouraging the youngest authors to team with somebody that has expertise that's done this before, that can help guide them through and say, this is the way to make it acceptable at the very highest level.
I think you're absolutely right. I've been to the poster sessions, 3 paper sessions. I've approached at least 2 people, given them a card and said, this is great work. You need to send this to us. Please do. And I would encourage them to come to meetings like this, talk to people, see what else is being presented. It's a great shot window for your research. And if it's good, people come to it. Might need a bit of development, but it's about getting out there. And even if it's not this time, or it's a smaller journal, you'll see other presenters. They always say, come and talk to us. All the members of the editorial board usually get there because they're quite friendly and approachable. Don't be worried about their name. Just tap us on the shoulder and say, can I talk to you about an idea, or can I talk to you about a study? I guarantee we'll all be more than happy to have a conversation over a cup of coffee.
And in Australia, that will be a flat white.
I've not noticed that. It's almost compulsory.
Well, thank you once again. It's been marvellous to have you. You'll be able to find a link to this podcast on our website, on our socials, and also in the ANZCA ASM newsletter. So thank you once again for a fantastic chat.
TopMedTalk. Thanks for downloading TopMedTalk. Don't forget to subscribe, check us out on YouTube, and of course on social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook and X. Also, it's important to remember that TopMedTalk is the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, evidence-based perioperative medicine. We'd love you to find out more about that, and the way to do that is ebpom.org. Check out our website and find out about some of the incredible conferences we're going to be arranging across the year. ebpom.org.